how long did it take you to get a solid following anywhere?
Yeah, I officially launched it in August of 2020. I
Mhm.
recorded my introduction episode, and then I think within a couple of months, it had already reached the Instagram had already reached like 1,000 followers. So I definitely think that there was a need for maybe that kind of content. And
Mhm.
sometimes I go back to see those very early on posts, and there were some of them that in those early weeks, months, I was getting like 500 likes or 700 likes, which is pretty significant for such a niche topic. And it's something that I'm proud of too, because I had no social media acumen. I didn't know how to like edit photos and resize them. I didn't know anything about the word limits and the captions, stuff like that.
Mhm.
Yeah, people kind of latched on very quickly. And I also don't have a lot of people in my family who are on social media, so it wasn't like they could spread the word for me or anything. I didn't know anything about social media marketing or ads.
Was it intended just to be a podcast? Were you always going to do like Instagram or Facebook posts?
During the pandemic, I was a master's degree student and kind of looking for a creative outlet. So again, I wasn't feeling, fully 100% fulfilled by this kind of technical pursuit that I was undergoing. So the whole reason why the page was started was to kind of give me that outlet that I needed for writing, to express the interest I had in music and history already. So I decided to start the podcast. At the time. It was called the Cutlass Podcast for anyone who, followed very early on. And initially it was intended to only be an audio podcast. I would interview people long form, those are the kinds of podcasts that I like, the hour, hour and a half, 2 hour long conversations. And that was really just the intent of it initially. And then maybe kind of share some of those episodes onto social media. I really didn't even use social media until I started the Cutlass, now the Cutlass
Mhm.
Magazine. I'd never been on Twitter. Facebook was just to get all the family updates, who's getting married, who's having a baby, all that. And then Instagram, I barely used it too. It was just like a private account.
Mhm.
But yes, it was never intended to be a social media platform. But I
Mhm.
think it just kind of gradually evolved from being the Cutlass podcast to then the Cutlass magazine. And the podcast itself kind of took a backseat to the online content. A lot of that
Mhm.
has to do with maybe my own issues of perfection because I was the person that, or the kind of person that I would do interviews, go back and listen to a 2 hour interview, and I would hear for when anybody is breathing, and I would edit out those little breaths that they took, and
Mhm.
it just became a little too labor intensive.
I found your like I remember like it was so significant that I actually remember the specific
Mhm.
post. It was in May of like 2021 and it was
Mhm.
your Indian Survival Day post. I don't know how it showed up in my Instagram feed
Mhm.
and it just resonated with me so much. And then since then I've just been a huge follower of the page. I don't think like I interact with like I don't comment on things very often. But like I just really like have always loved your content. And well, I'm for like the people listening to this, if you know me, you're probably coming from like my YouTube gaming YouTube interviews. So this is totally it's a very different space.
I'm always fascinated by how people find the page and what their journey is with it as well. And there have been so many times where I've randomly met people and I'll be talking about my interest in history and they're like, oh, you have to see this page on Instagram. And they show me the page and then I show them the page from my account. So it's always, yeah, it's always really interesting to see how people find it. I think that
Mhm.
post about Indian Survival Day, that was one of the ones that really kind of took off.
Tell me about that. How did that come about?
I remember preparing for May of 2021. That's when all the arrival dates come up. There's so many different countries, they have their own dates. And I was thinking, how am I going to capture everything and post everything? And so I was doing some planning. And several years before that, I had been doing my own research purely from a, perspective of being a history junkie and wanting to learn and just learning for myself and wanting to pick up all the things that had been left to me by my nanny and aji who had passed. And just with my cousins and my family, many years before I started the page, I had just started kind of jokingly referring to it as Indian Survival Day because learning how much trauma accompanied the arrival of them in the Caribbean, so many of them didn't even survive the journey from India to the Caribbean. So many of them had not signed up for what they had to do. They were lied to, tricked to. Those early years were plagued by so much suicide amongst the men, assault of the women, so much physical abuse, poverty. I thought arrival is a very um, interesting way of framing it because in the Caribbean you have a day for they call them shelter Baptists or spiritual Baptists, and their day is Liberation Day. For the descendants of enslaved Africans, they call it Emancipation Day. So a lot of those holidays, they're framed in a way to celebrate the end of a system, whereas for us, we're marking the beginning of one that was terrible for the vast majority of us. And I don't think that people were really celebrating the arrival in that sense. Maybe they were celebrating more that Indians came to the Caribbean, but I always thought that the language was very interesting. And
Mm-hmm.
going back into history, looking at the fight to get Indian culture and Indian history recognized as part of the larger mainstream Guyanese national identity, Trinidadian national identity, Caribbean regional identity. There was a lot of struggle with that. And there was always resistance towards Indian people getting their own day, getting their own platform, and they would face comments of like, go back to India, or the Caribbean is not an Indian space, or this is not a Hindu country, this is not an Indian country. They always kind of got these comments that were meant to otherize them, to say that they were a specific type of Trinidadian, or they weren't Trinidadian at all, or not Caribbean at all, and that they would
Mm-hmm.
always be other, always be different than. And so, in a lot of journals I read, statements by a lot of activists back in the day, they would often have to prove them being Trinidadian. They would have to say, no, we're here, we're staying, we're part of the national fabric now, we've arrived. And so, Indian Arrival Day was almost like a point to say, well, we got here and we're staying here. And so I really felt like it would be much better to celebrate the triumph in face of all of the difficulties, all of the obstacles, rather than kind of playing into this narrative that we were other than or not really Caribbean. And so
Mm-hmm.
and I also love a nice, play on words. So I thought Indian Survival Day had a certain ring to it, and I made a post about it in May of 2021, which is what you saw, and I'm sure many other people, because that was a very popular post. Um, and a lot of people resonated with it. It kind of changed the narrative around how people viewed the term, how they viewed the holiday, wanting to be more um, wanting to be more intentional about how they recognized it, incorporating more history, and it really started a nice discourse within the community. And I think that was kind of an early experience with causing a little janjat and having bacchanal and having people have issues with it or pushback or saying it was unnecessary. But as always, I try to make my point, and still to this day, I have people messaging me saying Indian Survival Day, and I see a lot of posts now coming out where people say Indian Arrival Day, also known as Indian Survival Day, and it seems like it's kind of permeated the culture in a certain way.
The Cutlass profile picture, your cousin was the artist behind it. How did you decide on the concept?
Yeah, so my cousin Jivan, who is in Trinidad, him and I were two graduate students kind of just stranded online during the pandemic. And he kind of similar, he's actually now a doctor. He was studying to be a doctor at the time, but
Oh,
I
wow.
guess like a lot of people in my family, he also has the creative side. And so I had the idea for the logo, and it was always there was always the intent to have a woman on the logo as well, because the I wouldn't have started the page if it wasn't for the influence of my nanny and my aji, my maternal and paternal grandmothers who had passed when I was in my teenage years, and that had a really profound impact on me. So I always wanted to have a woman on the logo. That was always the intent. And I think I've always been drawn to those images on postcards of Indian women in the Caribbean with their clothing that, seems so out of place. It looks like they should be in a village in India, but those postcards say, Georgetown, Guyana, and Port of Spain, Trinidad, and the
Mhm.
juxtaposition of that I was always fascinated by. So I always had that idea in mind. So I told my cousin, I want to have a woman in the center, because so often history will kind of forget women in the process, and I wanted to make that a huge part of the story that I was telling. I always wanted to have the sugarcane in the background because that's part of our past. That was the reason we were brought to the Caribbean. I wanted to have that color red, because if anyone knows the history of red, it's particularly, resonant in the Indian community and also in the Indo-Caribbean community across all different religions as well. Sometimes it'd be used to make fun of Indian people in the Caribbean. So I really wanted
Mhm.
to have that as a way to reclaim the color. Cutlass, I knew that that would be the name because it was so resonant with everyone from our community, and I wanted that to be immediate.
Mhm.
And yeah, the white that the woman is wearing, I think many of us, or a lot of us at least our age, can remember those old women with their white orhani, and they wear those, pretty much 24/7 sometimes. And
Mhm.
I wanted that to also be part of the part of the imagery as well, with her holding a cutlass.
Around the cutlass itself, was that intended to be a mala?
Yeah, that was intended to be a mala because I find that across religions that's a huge part of devotion. So whether you're a Christian, Catholics have their rosary beads,
Mhm.
Muslims have their beads as well that they use to pray with, and then we Hindus have our mala that we use to jape, or recite our prayers as we count to 108. And so
Mhm.
I wanted to have that through line of the religion being something that would have held them through or kept them through all of the kind of struggles that they went through, and just including other visual motifs in there as well. If you see on her, around her wrist, there's a gold bearer, which I knew would be instantly recognizable by anybody in our community. She has the three dots on her chin, a godna, which a lot of the women from that generation had, and women in my family had, as something they would have to get before they get married, a kind of tribal tattoo.
Mhm.
Yeah, and I wanted her to wield the cutlass as well, because I don't know if people might be familiar with that very famous feminist iconography from the US of that woman flexing, and she's kind of showing off her bicep. And the way that she's kind of flexing and in a certain posture, I wanted to have that reflected with the woman holding a cutlass.
And she has a solemn expression on her face. Was that why did you choose that?
Yeah, I found at the time a lot of the Indo-Caribbean spaces online. It was a lot of about the music, the partying and the culture, the sort of fete lifestyle, carnival, and a lot of the more colorful, bright aspects of the culture. But I really wanted to create a space that was a little bit more serious, that could, balance humor with history. And so I didn't want it to seem, I thought it'd be weird if she's standing in front of a cane field with a big smile on her face. And I really wanted to show that the reality of the experiences. So kind of giving her a more neutral expression. All of those ideas I communicated about the logo. I had all of that in mind, and once I finalized that, I just told my cousin about it. Basically, presented up all the ideas, the things I wanted to have featured in the imagery, the Gudna, the Bera, the Orhani, the cane in the background, the green of the cane fields with the red of what she's wearing. And I communicated all of that to him and my intent for it. And he was very happy to find some kind of excuse not to study for his exams. So he put it together in pretty much, I would say, less than 2 days. He had put that together, and I came up with the name, the Cutlass, and maybe like an hour or something like that. And now, 5 years later, it's all still present.
What obstacles have you run into running the Cutlass?
There's kind of two aspects to the Cutlass magazine as it exists now. There's the historical content, which I always post, and I pretty much post like every other day for like 5 years now, and that's pretty active. But I do also share my opinions on certain topics because I think that, um, I feel like the level of discourse in our community is still at a level of curry chicken versus chicken curry, and I'm
Yeah.
very tired of that, and I don't even, engage in that conversation anymore. So I do make an effort to kind of put myself, my name, and the brand of the Cutlass magazine out there to talk about certain topics and not be afraid to pose questions back to the community. And that comes with a lot of flack, especially when you have a following that is Indo-Caribbean people who are Generation Z, Indo-Caribbean people who are millennials, Indo-Caribbean people who are older, a different demographic that's following on Facebook versus Instagram versus Twitter versus TikTok, people who live in the Caribbean, people who live abroad, recent migrants, people who are generations long established abroad, and everyone has their own experiences and their own opinions. And so I
Mhm.
always knew that that side of the Cutlass where I share a lot of my opinions, and those opinions are typically on Instagram stories or Twitter, my tweets on there. That's where I share a lot of the opinion side of it. And I do make a very clear distinction of this is the historical information with sources, people I interview, all of that. And then this is
Mhm.
where I'm kind of posing, topics to the community for debate. And I think last year in particular, there were a lot of things that I had posted, a lot of conversations that I was having about, the word coolie, for example, or politics, or identifying as Indo-Caribbean, and our ties to South Asia versus not having ties. And there are a lot of things
Mhm.
that people had disagreements about. And I think also, like with any platform, there are always going to be people that have an issue with you. And it's something that I try not to take personally because from the very beginning of when I started the platform, I had issues like that. People not liking the post or not liking me for some reason, or I don't know what that's about in particular, but I try not to take personal offense. Just because last year there was a lot of things happening politically and in the world,
Mhm.
a lot of the topics that I was posting or sharing about really kind of inspired a lot of fervent debate compared to when I had started in late 2020. And so, yeah, I did think for a second about pulling back or not really continuing it because I don't know, some people might not know, but I'm the only person that works on the Cutlass magazine. I manage the accounts across platforms. Every comment that gets responded to, that's my response. Every email that I take care of that. Everything that has to do with the page, I'm handling it. So it's pretty much like a full-time job that's largely done on like a volunteer basis. In addition to my full-time job, in addition to the research I'm always doing. Like I mentioned, I just came back from New York. That was to visit friends and just to travel, but also I had research work there as well. So there's very limited time that I have to waste. I think kind of having issues with people last year and kind of fielding some complaints that people had with the page and why aren't you talking about this topic? People feeling like I was purposely ignoring something and because of the way that I work very independently, I always knew that I, representing the Cutlass magazine, would be very happy to collaborate with other people, but I never really had any plans of bringing on like people to form like a Cutlass team, for example. So I always knew that I would have to shoulder all of the responsibility, and that responsibility felt very heavy last year. I thought about kind of shutting it down and not continuing with it, and just kind of doing my own research because it's not in pursuit of a PhD, it's not in pursuit of business or earning money, it's all a passion project. And I told myself from the very beginning, if I feel like this is impacting my love of the culture, my love of the community, and my passion for it, then I don't want to continue it. But I
Mm.
think I kind of continued to think more about it, and I realized I couldn't stop it. I just had to keep moving forward and maybe utilizing a block every once in a while if I have to, and um, just not taking anything personally. So I'm happy that, you know, whatever month that we're in right now, April, we're in April of 20,
Or in April, yeah.
April of 2025. I'm happy that, the page is still around and there's no plans to get rid of it.
Kind of like piggybacking off that, you make it clear in like the bio that it's a progressive platform.
That was always put in there because I knew that progressive means, one thing in the United States, it means one thing in Canada, it means one thing in Trinidad, Guyana, the UK. So everybody has a different context for it. So instead of just
Mhm.
being aligned with a political party, for example, what it really meant was showcasing our history in a way that didn't sugarcoat some of the more difficult topics. So talking about women's history, history of domestic abuse, the realities of indentureship and how it wasn't just a system of, Indians coming to the Caribbean getting paid and that was it. So
Mhm.
the progressive meant to be the way in which I would be tackling the history from a very holistic, comprehensive perspective. And then
Mhm.
just naturally because of who I am and because of my, background in the history and how knowledgeable I am about it, I obviously tend to bring up things that people might not be familiar with or they don't want to talk about, so it would be considered taboo. So, for example, as you mentioned last year, there was a lot of discourse on abortion happening, I think, world over, particularly in the United States. And so I made that series of tweets where I talked about how, abortion has been happening in our community for many generations now. And if you're like me and there were people from elder generations in your family, particularly the women, they went by many names. Some of them in Guyana, I think they called them Maidi. In Trinidad, they were Chamain, Chamarin, Dugrin, and those are women who help deliver babies, but they also help to abort babies. And these are the kind of stories that I heard growing up and hearing the older women talk about, even the older men talk about. I don't know if maybe it's a religious thing, being from a Hindu background, but whenever I heard them talking about abortion or terminating a pregnancy, there was never any attachment of, this is a wrong thing, it's a sin, or, somebody could go to hell for doing this. There was never any kind of um, religious connotation of it being a bad thing. So
Mhm.
being privy to those kinds of conversations, and I really wanted to offer an Indo-Caribbean perspective on it. And so having had those women in my family, having interviewed women like that in the community who are 80, 90, sometimes 100 years old, who themselves had abortions or had performed abortions for other women. I didn't want that perspective to be lost in the conversation. And so I didn't feel any hesitance about sharing that. I've never really felt apprehensive about anything I share. I kind of just think I'll share it and whatever happens, happens, and I'll deal with it.
Mhm.
But particularly for that post, I would say that I was actually very surprised with the amount of support I received on that post. There were a lot of people, young, old, men, women, who supported it from abroad, also from the Caribbean. I think if I would have just made a very blanket post about abortion, there probably would have been pushback. But
Mhm.
because I
Mhm.
couched it into so much history and I included words like Chamain, Dugrin, Chamarin, words that certain generations would be familiar with, there was a certain undeniability of the post. Like if you're of a certain generation, you knew that those things happened. You could pretend to turn a deaf ear, but you know that that's true. You know what I'm saying is not false from a historical perspective. I
Mm-hmm.
actually think there was a lot of support for it. Interestingly enough, the most vocal detractors who didn't agree with it, there were a couple of men who had a problem with that post, which I thought was very interesting. But for the most part, the overwhelming majority of people, particularly women of all backgrounds, were in support of it or in support of understanding that at least this is a part of our history. It continues to happen and we can't deny it. I think in terms of backlash, there are other things I've posted. One time I made a post about Queen Elizabeth and how, aristocracy does not matter to me at all, and it shouldn't matter for us, and how much it's had an impact on our community and our history and all of that. And that I think I actually may have gotten some more backlash from, because I think a lot of our, grandparents, aunties, and uncles, we forget kind of grew up as part of the Commonwealth and they were fed all of this, for lack of a better word, propaganda growing up about how proud or what a sense of pride it was to be, part of the Commonwealth, part of the empire, all of that. So I got a lot of
Mm-hmm.
backlash for that, surprisingly. Typically, conversations around the word coolie, particularly between like Trinidadian and Guyanese people, get a lot of discussion going. And yeah, so actually, when you talked about, controversial topics, that abortion one is probably on the bottom of my list, surprisingly. There's a lot of other things I posted that have kind of garnered some, I don't want to say controversy, how about Janchat or couture?
The term coolie, do you reclaim it or are you just like I only talk about it in a historical context?
Yeah, within a historical context, that's when I would use the word
Yeah.
coolie, but in a typical Trinidadian fashion, I was always told growing up that you don't use it, you don't identify by it, it's a derogatory word, and
Yeah.
the reason why is that, people in my family, the elders, they would always share the history with us. They would tell us about how, when Indians came from India to the Caribbean, they would call them bound coolies. Sometimes the barracks that they would put them to live in, they would call them coolie lines because it was just, rows of houses, one after another,
Mhm.
very small, cramped spaces. The Indians that come from the part of Trinidad that I come from, which is very agricultural area, they would call them hill coolies or bush coolies, and that was to distinguish them from the more kind of educated class of Indians, the one who had converted to Presbyterianism, Catholicism, had taken English names, wore Western dress, and so that was even meant to divide people within the community as well as just
Mhm.
Indians as a whole. And so
Mhm.
knowing all of that, hearing my parents tell us stories about how if they took, sada roti and fry aloo and things like that for lunch to school, there was a nursery rhyme that they would sing, "Coolie coolie, come for roti, when all the roti done, all the coolie run." Little things like that that they would sing to make fun of them for bringing Indian food, because I think particularly for us growing up nowadays, we're not familiar with the fact that Indian food now is seen as synonymous with, part of the Caribbean diet, right? Roti, curry, doubles, all of that. It's seen as part of Trinidadian cuisine, Guyanese cuisine. It's very mainstream now. But there was a very long time where it wasn't part of the mainstream. And something like doubles, a lot of people consider doubles to be poor people food or consider doubles to be lower class food or food that was just meant for people who work and had to get a quick meal. It wasn't considered this symbol of Trinidadian identity and Trinidadian
Mhm.
culture the way it is now. So people forget that, our culture wasn't always seen as being part of Trinidadian national identity. And so for
Mhm.
our parents and our grandparents who lived in that time when it was very separate, they know how that word coolie was used against them. One of the
Mhm.
reasons why I had so many of the visual motifs in the logo is because my mom would tell me that, sometimes when they would wear red, like for a wedding, if they were like passing in a village or something, people would shout out from their houses, like all the coolies wearing red, stuff like that, right? Or they would call
Mhm.
red a coolie color. Or she talks about the time when she's walking to school and some girls would make fun of her and say, look, the coolie with oil in her hair is dripping oil, stuff like that. So I always heard about it in that context. And then even when, people do use it, it's oftentimes in a very derogatory way. If a man drinks a lot, he's a coolie man. If he hits his wife,
Hmm.
he's a coolie man.
Yeah.
And it's if somebody is late, they say, "Oh, coolie people time," like you don't respect other people's time. So it's always used
Hmm.
in a very derogatory
Negative
sense.
way.
Yes,
Hmm.
growing up in a Trinidadian context with my family, it was if somebody calls you that, you fight them. I grew up in a very,
Yeah.
I grew up in a very feisty family that, would tell us to kind of stand up for ourselves. And, um, then when you grow up abroad and you encounter South Asian people, you hear that for them, coolie is like a low class worker, a low caste person, a porter, or as we say in Trinidad, always toting something on their head.
Hmm.
Surinamese people, Indo-Surinamese, they very rarely use it as well. So they don't identify by it. People in Trinidad, it's still a very taboo word. If you call someone that, you might get a tight slap or something.
Yeah.
A lot of people say that in Jamaica it has been reclaimed, but it's very
Mm.
important to remember that the Indo-Jamaican population, the population of Indians in Jamaica, never really surpassed more than 2 to 3% of the overall population. Even though they're the
Mm.
second largest ethnic group in Jamaica,
Mhm.
population is still very small comparatively. They were never half of the population or a third of the population like you might find in Trinidad, Guyana, Suriname. And so they didn't
Mhm.
really have much control over how racial slur was used against them. There's maybe like 1% now living in Jamaica, and a huge proportion of the Indo-Jamaican community lives abroad. And I know that because a lot of them live in Miami, a lot of them live in Tampa, London, places like that. And I find that the ones who are older and have left Jamaica, they also don't use it and they see it as a derogatory word. The ones who
Mhm.
still live in Jamaica, are younger, maybe they're mixed heritage themselves, they use it. But also in that case, it's very interesting because they use coolie in Jamaica as a way to kind of fetishize somebody. If you're someone who's maybe 10% Indian or quarter Indian, they'll say, oh, look, you have coolie eyes because your eyes are round in a certain way or almond shaped in a certain way. Or, oh,
Mhm.
that girl has what they call nice hair. She must have some coolie in her. Or she's fair skinned. She must have some coolie in her. So even in that
Mhm.
way, it's a very fetishized word and it's not even used in like a nice context.
Yeah.
I think Guyana is a very unique case because going back generations, it seems like they have reclaimed it for a positive. I think it's
Mhm.
important to remember that Guyana experienced a very um, massive migration in like the 50s and 60s because of the political turmoil there. So I don't know if maybe that led to why they needed to establish some kind of community identity, one that would take
Mhm.
them abroad, and why it ended up becoming coolie. I've even spoken to like a 80-year-old Guyanese person. They say the word coolie, and I feel like scandalized hearing them say it. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's an interesting topic, but I do also think it's important to remember that there is nuance, for example. So as I mentioned with Jamaica, there's nuance. Ever since I posted about coolie on social media, there have been so many Guyanese people who have come forward and said, oh, I actually don't use it either. And I'm so happy that you're talking about it because everyone assumes that if you're Guyanese and Indian, you use it as well. And that
Mhm.
led to conversations about if anyone using it should have to be from within the community or things like that.
One of the more fascinating sides of indentureship is jahaji. Can you go into what that is?
So the word itself, jihad is the word for a ship, a boat, a vessel. And it's very interesting to know that word because it speaks to our linguistic origins, being more in Bhojpuri and Awadhi than Hindi, because in Hindi they say jahaz with a Z at the end instead of a J, if I were to explain it in English, but we say jihad. And so even that shows exactly where our mother tongue comes from. And so when you had all of these people coming over for indentureship, many of them had been lied into what they were signing up for. And when I say signing up for, many of them were illiterate, so they just put a cross on a paper in English that they couldn't read and ended up on a boat, and many of them were told that they were going to Suriname, which the British people very cleverly referred to as Sri Ram, as they're going to the land place of the birthplace of Lord Ram. So that was a tool of trickery there. They employed a lot of Indian middlemen who they called Arkatia to kind of go meet Indian people and sell them all these false narratives about you're going to Trinidad, Chini being the word sugar. So you're going to go there to reap sugar and you'll earn gold pieces and become very wealthy. All of these lies that they were told, being told that they'd be sent to another part of India or to Mauritius, because Mauritius had indentureship very early, and Mauritius is right off the coast. And so they thought maybe that would be a shorter journey. And so many of them now ended up on a ship that was a 3, 4, 5 months long journey, right? And for people that have lived this very sheltered life of only being in India, maybe only being in their village, to now be picked up, sent to a port in Calcutta or Madras, as they called it back then, and then suddenly they're on a ship, food is running out, women are being assaulted by some of the sailors on board. There's small children, people are dying from disease. There are many stories I've heard of, if there were very rough seas and a storm came, that the captains or the sailors would be so paranoid about what was happening that they thought, okay, well, if we made some kind of sacrifice, maybe that would calm the storm. So they would take a baby and throw them overboard and things like that. Or people would off themselves and jump overboard thinking that, they were still close enough that they could swim back. And so you hear about all those stories, and so it's not surprising that the Indian people formed a bond on the ship, and they refer to themselves as jahaji bhai or jahaji bahin, meaning ship brothers and ship sisters. The overall overwhelming majority of them were young people our age. And so if you think about you and I, right, if somebody put us on a ship, we had no grandparents, no parents, send us off to a foreign land, and they tell us, you are now responsible for carrying on the community, history, legacy, culture. What do we do, right? We're young people. We don't have all the information. A lot of our culture, if you think about it, was pieced together by young people separated from their family. In some cases, they're the only person from their family coming over. And so they formed these very intense, close bonds on these ships where when they landed in the Caribbean, they had adopted each other as parents, as siblings, or some met on the ship and got married and stayed together when they came off the ship. And so that Jahaji Bhai, Jahaji Bahin relationship is one that we always pay tribute to every May for Indian Arrival Month or Indian Survival Days. And it just shows to go how treacherous the journey was and how it held them together and created a very immediate sense of community amongst people who are almost completely strangers to each other. If you think about the kind of social stratification that existed in India, right? Every village you go to, there are people under a multitude of different castes, religious backgrounds. People got picked up from predominantly Uttar Pradesh and Bihar for indentureship, but also Madras, parts of Bengal at that time, different parts of India. And so these people are all on a ship. They're different castes, different religions. Some of them don't speak the same language. There are all of these things that are barriers for them. They might not even have a language to communicate in. And
Mm-hmm.
yet, because of just the experience itself, it overcame those caste barriers. It overcame those religious barriers. And they would have been coming from a society where you would never interact with somebody outside of your caste. You would never interact with somebody outside of your religion. You'd never meet somebody who spoke a different language than you because you just spent your whole life in one village or with your own community. And so the fact that the journey was so rough that they would even call the water Kala Pani, dark waters, black waters, it erased a lot of those things that divided them and united them under common experience. At the time that I was starting the Cutlass, there was a very small Indo-Caribbean community online. It was Cooliegram on Instagram, which people know is a like meme-centric, reel-centric page with a lot of humor on there. There
Hmm.
was Indo-Caribbean Alliance, which is still active, which is New York-based, and then Jahaji Sisters, and they also New York, particularly Queens-based. And so those are the three, what do they call it? The Trinity? That was like the Indo-Caribbean social media trinity at the time that I joined. We're all, supportive of each other and how we can help one another. And even that is a nice little tribute to the Jahaji relationship, complete strangers being bounded by community, shared history, and being willing to support one another like that. Yeah, even I don't know if you know like the words Perosi, Perosan.
I've heard the word.
Yeah, it means neighbor. Perosi is a male neighbor and Perosin is a female neighbor. And so, oftentimes people would use that in Trinidad, Guyana for their neighbors, but for the elders, they would call them Jahaji and Jahajin, specifically elders of a certain age, because even if they were not on a ship with each other, they still had that seniority of remembering the indentureship experience and what they would have endured, that relationship endured, and that using that word as a way to respectfully address one another continued even once they had landed in Trinidad, Guyana, Jamaica, Suriname, all the other islands, Martinique, and that relationship was preserved.
You get Hinduism hate comments.
This kind of goes back to the whole wanting to address taboo issues and
Yeah.
not wanting to hesitate about it, or the progressive in the profile bio. I think that in the Caribbean, there's a lot of cultural mixture, right? And we often use that as our selling point of, look at our food, look at all the religions we have, all the music. And I think compared to other places in the world, the Caribbean is definitely um, very inclusive and celebratory of different cultures, and some parts of the Caribbean, because there are also some parts of the Caribbean where I think we forget the culture is very homogenized and they didn't have a lot of different ethnic groups coming and religions and all that. But certainly places like Trinidad and Guyana and Suriname and Jamaica and Martinique and Grenada, we had indentureship, Chinese people coming, Middle Eastern people coming, different faiths being brought, all of that. So by and large, compared to the issues we see around diversity in the US and Canada and the United Kingdom and places where you could be, jailed for practicing different religions, the Caribbean is very much progressive in that way. It's always important to remember that our ancestors faced a lot of discrimination for their beliefs, right? They
Hmm.
were missionaries trying to convert them. There was a time in Trinidad, if you wanted to become a teacher, you had to convert to Christianity. That was just a rule. It wasn't
Hmm.
some of you have to, it was all of you have to if you want to become a teacher. That's a job requirement. If you want to get a job outside of working in the cane fields, you have to get baptized, you have to get an English name, you have to do all these things, stop wearing Indian clothing. There was the whole Wisma massacre in Guyana. There was Marienburg massacre in Suriname with indentured laborers who rose up against their overseer. There was the Jose riots in Trinidad. There's a lot of discrimination that people faced for their religion, for their culture, and that continues even till this day. So there have been many times where I've posted about Hinduism because that is, my background, and that's a background that most Indo-Caribbean people have. It's the majority religion. And I get a lot of hateful comments from people within the Indo-Caribbean community, but also people from the larger non-Indian Caribbean community. A lot of it has to do with their views on Christianity, their feelings that Hinduism is demon worship, devil worship, pagan worship, idolatry, all of the kind of hot button words they throw at it. Every year around Diwali, there's always some kind of discourse from people saying that don't go by a Hindu prayers, they do stuff to the food, don't eat from them.
Yeah.
There's some denominations in the Caribbean, some very extreme denominations. Some of them are actually kind of popular, where they tell you not to eat from the same, pots that Hindus cook from. And so it's very important to talk about those things because they're persistent, and it happens still to this day that if you post you think posting a photo of a 98-year-old lady praying would be
Yeah.
universally agreed upon thing in the world, but it inspired a lot of very hateful comments, some racist comments. And yeah, I always like to address those things because even now I've made several posts about temples in Trinidad being vandalized. Recently, they were having a Ram Leela a couple years ago, and they burned down the structure that these people spent so much time and money trying to build for their performance. They burned it down. There was so many issues of vandalism before that. And it's important to remember that in terms of religion, in places like Trinidad, Guyana, Suriname, Hinduism was the religion that was the most widely discriminated against, in terms of them being the last demographic to get marriage rights, them being the last demographic to be able to establish their own schools, to be able to get cremated. That took, even that simple rite of cremation took until the mid 1900s, even later than that for some people to get. So we, meaning myself, anybody who is Hindu, very much the most discriminated religious group in terms of legal rights and just overall treatment. And you see a
Mhm.
lot of those stereotypes. When you hear about coolie red, they're talking about oftentimes Hindu weddings or the red chandi that they put for Lord Hanuman Puja. So a lot of those stereotypes, points of discrimination, oftentimes target largely Hindus, and that is just because we are the majority of the population that came. And then
Mhm.
also in the Caribbean, there was this idea that a religion like, say, Islam was more in proximity with Christianity. So they were able to get rights earlier, go to school earlier. There was the Nation of Islam, all of those movements that started to get very popular in America, that then you had a lot of Afro-Caribbean people converting from Christianity to Islam. And so that made, the livelihoods of Indian Muslims in the Caribbean a lot better. So people forget about that point of the Indo-Caribbean Hindus having a very specific experience, also with the word coolie itself.
When we first spoke, I was like a new mom, I believe.
Yeah, I've actually had a very significant amount of people that said, your page is the reason why now I'm teaching my kids or soon to be kids with like Mausi, Mausa, Mamu, Mami, Aja, Aji, Nana, Nani, because you kind of think that maybe those terms are older or they're outdated, but now they're kind of being rebranded as cool and something trendy and to pass on. So I've had countless people tell me that, they just had a grandkid and before they were just gonna have them, call them grandma, whatever, but now it's Nana, Nani, now it's Aja and Aji. I had some parents reach out to me and tell me that they wanted their kid to learn another language, so they were thinking maybe French, maybe Spanish, and because of the page, they signed them up in a Hindi class. Or they wanted their kid to learn an instrument, and they were thinking piano, violin, and now it's tabla or dholak or sitar,
Mhm.
or instead of ballet, now their daughters want to do Kathak or Bharatnatyam and stuff like that.
Mhm.
I've had a lot of people tell me that the page has had a very tangible impact on how they identify, how they want to raise their children, how they want their grandchildren to be raised. I've had several youth groups at different temples, mandirs, they call them Bal Vikas or Bal Vihar. Those groups reach out to me and ask me for permission to take my posts and use it as educational content for the Temple Youth Group, and that's always very exciting to see. I'll actually be speaking at a Hindu heritage camp at a Trinidadian temple in August. I'll be one of the speakers for that.
Oh,
Uh,
wow.
so I've had a lot of people, yeah, message me and ask for certain things to help them pass on the culture. And I'm always very happy to see that, they're inspired by the page to continue using the words. I had someone tell me actually that she homeschools her children and she prints out the captions of some of the posts and shares it with them because she said how they're learning about Italian history and French history, why not Caribbean history? And
Mhm.
learning with them. Individuals who have told me that for Indian Survival Month, the Indian Arrival Days, they actually sit down now with people in their family and they read about the history for the first time and unpack things. And because of the page, they've now been motivated to talk to elders in their community and hit record to document the stories that they're learning. So I'm very happy to get that kind of feedback.
How should the younger generation preserve the culture?
I think the word I always come back to is being intentional about how they preserve the culture, being intentional about passing on certain words that we have in the community, something as simple as, using words like chanjat and kachur and puhar and chamke and all of those words that many of us grew up hearing. We're at a risk of a whole new generation being raised without those terms. Being intentional about passing on certain foods. So you might not like karaili, for example. A lot of people don't like karaili, but
Mhm.
maybe make it every once in a while for the kids and grandkids and let them decide if they don't like it rather than having it disappear or being very intentional about playing the music, whether it's chutney music, Bollywood music, the local classical music that we have, folk music. I've made a lot of posts about chutney music. And because I could speak the language, because I understand the language, I translate a lot of them. So there's a lot of, classic chutney songs that have been around since the 60s, 70s, 80s that I posted the meaning for. Sundar Popo songs, Babla and Kanchan, Rakesh Yankaran, Sambujam, Drupati Ramganai, all of these are very important people in our community, in our musical history. I take a lot of the classic songs and I put the English meaning. And there's some people who 50 years of hearing that song and they understand it for the first time ever. And being intentional about playing that music, knowing what it means. Is it a religious song? Then you could also sing it at the temple. Is it a song that celebrates the birth of a child? You could sing it when a baby is born. Knowing more about the history of indentureship and what people went through, knowing that our culture is so much more than doubles, Bollywood, saris, curry, soca, carnival. There's so much depth to it. And I post about this a lot, but in, 10, 20, 30 years, that generation of Indo-Caribbean people who had parents from India, who had grandparents from India, that generation will be all gone 2 decades from now. There won't be any more women alive who wear orhini. There won't be any more women alive who have a godna. There won't be very many people alive who know how to sing biraha music, know how to sing a sohar, know how to sing local classical, things like that. And it's very important that we have to take up that mantle and learn all these things. I posted about sohar, for example, which is a style of song that women would sing for whenever a baby is born, a Hindu baby. And so many people send me videos of them at the birth of their own child, nephew, niece, and on the 6 days, on the 12 days, on the 10 days, depending on what community you're from. They'll send me a video of them singing these Sohar songs and being very intentional about preserving those customs. So I always tell the younger generation that we relied on the kind of guiding hands of our Nani and Nana and Aja and Aji and the pundit or the imam or just elders in the community, but that generation will be gone and the knowledge with them. And a lot of that knowledge is not written down on paper, it has not been recorded on video. And so what happens if someone 20 years from now says, "Oh, I'd really like to learn how to sing an Indo-Caribbean style birha." If nothing is written down, if nothing is recorded, then that part of the culture is just dead. And so I think that we're at a crossroads right now where um, many people now in the community are being born in the US and abroad, and they're being born to parents who are maybe even born here. Our immigration abroad started a long time ago. Many people, many young people leaving the Caribbean due to brain drain and settling abroad. And our culture was reshaped and had to survive a major migration from South Asia to the Caribbean. And we're experiencing a second wave of that now with going abroad to the United States to Canada to the United Kingdom and other places. Some people went to Virginia, for example. So I think
Yeah.
we have to be very smart about talking to our elders, documenting, writing down, passing down, not being ashamed of the culture, not thinking that it's broken or low class, low caste, all of this nonsense that we kind of heard from older generations, this internalized shame. We have to undo that, relearn, reclaim, and stop kind of erasing our ancestral traditions.